What is cyberpunk? That is absolutely the question we are going to answer today as we delve into a brand new series from the Gray Matters blog talking about what are the various punk genres, what is a punk genre, exploring all the different steampunk, solar punk, lunar punk, you name it. We're going to cover it throughout this series. Today, we're going to be focusing on what makes cyberpunk punk. And one of the things we're really going to cover here is not just the aesthetics. We're going to cover what the aesthetics are, but I want to really delve into the fact of what makes a punk genre punk and not just basically retrofuturism or what have you, or futurism in the case of cyberpunk. We'll get into all of that. So, Hatter, are you ready to delve into the punk genres and also let us know kind of what is your experience with cyberpunk? Do you know much about cyberpunk? Have you dealt with it very much? Kind of let us know where you're coming at because everyone, Hatter is our guest host who is a little less familiar with the punk genres than we are, although I do think cyberpunk is his strong suit out of all the punk genres.
Oh yeah, I know a bit more about cyberpunk than the others. And when I hear the punk genre, the first thing I think is Nazi punks, Nazi punks, Nazi punks. Off. I'll bleep that. But yeah, I know cyberpunk. I know the idea of punk. We talked a bit about it. You mentioned a lot about corporate greed and the criticism of power structures in the world at large. And yeah, that's obviously what punk rock music is too. And yeah, Cyberpunk, I've actually been interested in for quite some time. Not just since Cyberpunk 2077 came out, but I read a lot of dark sci-fi, a lot of darker speculative fiction. That just tends to be what I'm drawn to, and Cyberpunk is almost always that. It rarely has a happy ending. But there's a lot of punk genres that I've been learning about recently. Like you mentioned one, solar punk, atom punk, punk punk. Have you ever read any punk punk?
I don't think I've ever read punk punk.
Well, good because I just made it up. But yeah, you get what I'm saying.
Absolutely. And so let's kind of delve into exactly what we're talking about and where this all comes from. First thing we have to say is that when we're talking the punk genres, it does all come from punk rock music. That is where we get the term. That's also where we get the attitude. That's where it has, that's why, in order to have its roots in punk rock music, it has to be rebellious. It has to be rebelling against systems of power specifically. So that's why it can be things like the government, it can be things like corporations. Whenever we go into different time periods, like in steampunk, it's often against things like the aristocracy and things like that. So it can be against any system of power. It doesn't have to be any specific one. And including, we could have cyberpunk, where again, like we hinted a little bit that it tends to be against corporations, but the government can be the villain, can be the thing we're rebelling against. Theoretically, if you had it set up a certain way, you could also be criticizing aristocracy or any other system of power. It just has to be rebelling against systems of power to be considered a punk. And this is actually kind of one of my pet peeves is people like throwing the trappings of punk on stuff and then they like have the authority figures be the good guys and I'm like, I'm sorry, if your authority figures are being presented as the desirable outcome, as the good people, as the protagonist, anything like that, you're not writing punk. That's not punk. It may be something like punk. There are other things, we can have things that have cyberpunk trappings that are not cyberpunk. A great example of that is Star Trek. Star Trek is utopian. Star Trek has augmented humans, holodecks, cyberspace. They have all this type of stuff, the futuristic technology, computers, all of that. They have a lot of the trappings of cyberpunk, but it's the attitude that makes it absolutely not cyberpunk at all. There's no hint of dystopia. There is no rebelling against systems of power. So we can definitely have all the trappings without it being punk at all. Star Trek being a good example of something that is definitely not cyberpunk.
I like Star Trek. That's my
Well, Star
commentary
Trek
on all that.
Well, Star Trek is great. And whenever I tell someone their favorite series doesn't count as punk, it's not cyberpunk or steampunk or whatever, they tend to get angry. And I'm like, no, look, I'm not saying your thing's not great. There's nothing wrong with this series that you like. I love Star Trek, but Star Trek's not cyberpunk. We don't have to call it punk for it to be valid. So, one thing I want to cover now, because of course it has to have its roots in punk. The next thing we need to talk about is that the grandfather of all the punk genres is cyberpunk. That was the first one. That's why we call them all blank punk. Because cyberpunk was basically, hey, what if we envision this futuristic cyber technological future but we approached it from a punk direction where we look at the systems of power that are creating this future are the bad guys. And so we have this rebellious nature. So cyberpunk was the first thing. The term was first coined in a short story called Cyberpunk from the 1980s, and it was quickly followed up by things like Neuromancer, things like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which led directly into Blade Runner, which is definitely cyberpunk. So we have a lot of the stuff from the 80s, cyberpunk being very popular in the 80s. So we have a ton of stuff where they're kind of talking about that. And pausing, I think the real solidification of what cyberpunk is kind of came from the cyberpunk TTRPG, which started with Cyberpunk Red, and now, of course, most people are familiar with from Cyberpunk 2077, the video game, and all that kind of stuff. Cyberpunk Edge Runners, which are all fantastic, by the way, all really good. And if you're not familiar with any of those, basically the TTRPG, which is kind of like Dungeons and Dragons, where you sit around and roll dice and narrate the activities of your character, where you get to play these characters who are in this cyberpunk world, and you tend to play something called an edge runner, which are, again, it reinforces the punk element where you are someone who is kind of outside the law. You are kind of operating in opposition to the systems of power, to the corporations, to things like that. So it very much reinforces those punk themes just by who you play as in general. And then, of course, the Cyberpunk 2077 video game, very punk, very anti systems of power. All the people from the corporations are all absolutely horrible. I would argue that there is an expansion where I think they get a little soft on the government. That's just my personal opinion. But there is the Phantom Liberty expansion where I feel like some of the people from the mainland American government are treated like a little too like shiny, like they're treated like, oh, these are the people who will save us from the corporation. It's not quite that bad, but it's still that, man, I just feel like they got a little away from the true punk
Yeah.
feel in that, because they were trying to offer some hope, and I get that, but this is cyberpunk. You're not supposed to do that.
Yeah, pretty much. Here's my question though. Like we talked about what the primary enemies are in a lot of punk genres. What would the primary enemy be in Atom or Solar Punk? Well, Solar Punk's probably polluters.
Well, that's actually really interesting, and we will do a full video on some of these later. Atom Punk is usually going to be the government, because we'll do a quick recap. Guys, this we are focusing on cyberpunk here, but this is also the intro to punk series here. So we're going to be telling you a little bit about all the types of punk and helping you get a grasp and get ready for the later videos we do, because we're going to do a whole video on solar punk, whole video on atom punk, lunar punk, sail punk. Everything's going to get its whole own video. But to answer Hatter's question, in atom punk, it's usually the government. It's going to be either A, the government, or B, if it's post-apocalyptic, some new person trying to become a government. And just so that everyone knows, if you're wondering what atom punk is, it's Fallout. If you've ever played the Fallout games, atom punk is Fallout. To give it more of a good definition, it is a punk genre, often but not always post-apocalyptic. Any of the genres can be post-apocalyptic, but I've mostly seen atom punk be post-apocalyptic because it's usually set after the bombs fall. And it usually is going to have a lot of aesthetics from the 60s. So you're going to have a lot of things of like jingoism in America, extreme nationalism from America, anti-communism in America, that American 50s and 60s vibes, the Leave It to Beaver household kind of thing. You're going to see a lot of those type of themes, and it's going to be rebellion both against the very extreme American government, that was set up at the time, or whatever stand-in they have for that. And then you're going to have also kind of rebelling against just like societal norms. Usually you'll have a lot of people behaving in ways that would not have been socially acceptable at that time, because of course in the 50s everyone was very big on the whole, homogenous, perfect, suburban, 2.3 kids kind of lifestyle. So you're definitely going to see a lot of that. In solar punk is really interesting. For one, it's important to remember there's not a ton of solar punk media. We see a lot of solar punk in art. We see a lot of solar punk in, just kind of discussion and ideals, but we don't have a ton of movies, video games, books, things like that. We're starting to see some video games, and there are a few short stories. But one of the things is solar punk is one of the exceptions to one of the elements that I actually am going to take this as an opportunity to talk about the punk genres. They tend to be dystopian. They don't have to be, but they are massively going to tend to be dystopian because they're about rebelling against a system. And no one wants to be rebelling against a good system. If the system was good, we wouldn't rebel against it. So by definition, we're going to have it be a bad system. So if you have a world with a bad system, that's by nature going to be dystopian. Solar punk is literally where someone said, "Hey, what if cyberpunk didn't suck?" That you wouldn't have solar punk without cyberpunk, because people looked at cyberpunk and what if we had this technology, but what if we did good stuff with it? So what if cyberpunk wasn't horrible? And that's where solar punk comes from, where people live in harmony with nature, they don't pollute, they actually have like egalitarian governments, so they're kind of utopian. Now I actually do have an answer for how we could do some really fun solar punk conflict. For one, the easiest way is to say, okay, we have a solar punk society, we have this city state, this nation that is solar punk, but over here, we have this other place that is cyberpunk. So we have our egalitarian solar punks being threatened by our corpo greed from our cyberpunk country. Um, Hatter actually did make a good suggestion. It could be people trying to pollute, people trying to sow discord. Basically, any threat to the solar punk way of life would be a really good villain in a solar punk story.
Okay, I like it. I can dig it.
Now, I do want to cover, because of course, what's the first thing everyone thinks of when they think of the punk genres is the trappings. So, what are the trappings? What are the aesthetics of cyberpunk? And some things we're almost always going to see in a cyberpunk story. We're going to see some kind of virtual reality, some kind of cyberspace, almost a given. We're going to see some kind of cybernetics, physical augmentation of humans. We might see biological augmentation of humans, but that actually is taking us a little bit into another genre called biopunk. And biopunk is kind of like cyberpunk, except instead of seeing more cybernetic enhancements, we see more genetic enhancements. That's where instead of seeing someone with a camera for an eye, we would see someone with genetically engineered cat eyes. Instead of having a gun for an arm, I'm more likely to have blades, like biological bone blades that pop out of my forearm.
Wolverine.
So that's where biopunk comes in. Go ahead.
I said Wolverine.
Wolverine is actually a cool example of a mix between biopunk and cyberpunk. If he were in that kind of story, he's actually in a superhero story, which is its own genre, completely different. Not to say that there aren't some superheroes that occupy a cyberpunk world, but that's a whole different issue. And we can actually talk about the superhero crossover at a later date. Some other of the trappings that you're definitely going to see is going to be like corporations. Again, you're going to almost always see corporations, even if they're not the main villain, they're going to be there at least as a tertiary or secondary villain. It's such an ingrained part of the genre. And I will say 90% of the time, it is going to be corporate greed, corporations. That's going to be your bad guys in cyberpunk. There are exceptions, but that's just such a traditional part of the genre. As someone once pointed out, and I thought was a really good point here, is that the real horror of cyberpunk is not, hey, have you replaced so much of your body with machine that you're no longer human? It's, hey, you have an electronic heart, and because you can't keep up your payments, they're going to turn it off because corporate greed is horrible. That is more what we're usually trying to explore in cyberpunk. I would actually argue that if you were focused more on the what is the nature of your humanity and focusing it just on the transhumanism of becoming more of a cyborg, I'd argue you're stepping a little bit outside of the cyberpunk bailiwick, unless we are talking about how, for instance, the government or the corporations are forcing people through economic pressure to have to lose more of their humanity. Then I'd say we're stepping back into cyberpunk. But there has to be a system of power that we are criticizing and depicting rebellion against for it to really jive with it.
That makes sense to me.
So now I want to talk a little bit about some examples of it, because we've actually covered some of the historical examples really well. And I feel like we've hit most of the major ones, because Cyberpunk 2077 is the main place, again, video game, is the main place people are going to know it from. Maybe the Cyberpunk Red or Cyberpunk, I forget what iteration we're on of the Cyberpunk TTRPG. But there's also just some general stuff. Like there is actually a fantastic series on Netflix right now called Altered Carbon. If you've never seen Altered Carbon, it is perfect cyberpunk with just a little bit of biopunk. Cyberpunk often crosses over with biopunk. We'll talk about how there's a lot of these kind of subgenres that like biopunk that pops up in almost everything. So in Altered Carbon, we have where the rich elites. Well, first of all, let's start with the basic premise that everyone has figured out a way to upload their consciousness basically into a computer chip that they call a stack, which is implanted at the base of your head. And it contains your entire personality and memories and all that sort of thing. And all you have to do to swap bodies is swap your stack into a new body. So now people are functionally immortal and can essentially be moved from one body to another. Where the cyberpunk element comes in is that if you're just being moved from normal body to normal body, you're not going to live forever because eventually you'll go mad because these bodies aren't perfect, yada, yada, yada. The only way to live forever, functionally and perfectly, is to have so much money that you can afford perfectly cloned bodies. And so only the rich truly get to live forever, and they call them Methuselahs. And then so you have these very rich people who essentially get to live forever, whereas the poor people are having to struggle to get a new body and all this kind of stuff. So it's very class oriented, it's very corporation oriented, although I will say it's less on the faceless corporation and it's more focused on the incredibly rich Methuselah people being the main villains. It also has themes of AI, artificial intelligence, and it actually has one of my favorite characters who is called Poe, and he is an artificial intelligence who is styled after Edgar Allan Poe, looks and talks like Edgar Allan Poe, and he is the AI that runs a hotel. And he has one of the coolest scenes in all of fiction where he saves the main character using like machine guns that are equipped to his AI hotel. He's just one of my Poe is one of my favorite characters. I highly recommend everybody watch Altered Carbon just for him. I will add the slight caveat that Altered Carbon is a very adult series, contains lots of adult stuff, nudity, that kind of stuff. So if you're not an adult, obviously don't watch Altered Carbon. If that sort of thing bothers you, don't watch Altered Carbon. But if you are an adult and you like that sort of thing, fantastic series. Can't recommend enough.
Yeah, if you're a big baby, don't watch Altered Carbon.
Uh, I didn't say it that way, but I'm not going to say it wrong.
I'm joking, of course. I'm just kidding.
Absolutely, absolutely. All viewpoints are valid, and everyone has different limits. I get that's just
Yeah.
not some people's thing, and that's totally fine. We're just kidding. It's okay.
Well, I think there is something I kind of want to add to the trappings, to like the the tropes and stuff. And I've been thinking about it while we were going over this. Punk, and we're going to talk about music first. Punk is a dirty genre, and now that's not to say that it's obscene. It very often is, but or that it's overly, what's the word I'm looking for here, abrasive. It's that it's very gritty. It's very down to earth. It's very honest, and it doesn't try to polish things. It doesn't try to make things seem, like a lot of fiction will polish and glorify. Punk genres, both in books, movies, in music, they don't do that. They're very honest, they're very real, and they're very gritty. So that's something I feel that we should mention. That's all I wanted to say.
Oh, no, I agree completely, and that is such a fantastic point to bring up. Is that a certain amount of grittiness, a certain amount of grim dark, a certain amount of now, of course, you take it too far and it'll get boring, but a certain amount of, like you said, that honest grittiness, that just in your face, here is what the world is like. That is absolutely, in my opinion, what is needed for something to be considered a punk genre in general, not just cyberpunk, but any of the punk genres. Because once you start polishing it up, once you start making it too nice and too shiny, I don't feel like it really qualifies as punk anymore.
Well, there's also happy punk, but I just made that up, so it probably doesn't mean anything.
Circling back to some more examples of the genre, of course, there's a lot of anime. There's Ghost in the Shell, there's Akira. Those are very classic ones. We're not going to go deeply into them. By the way, if in the comments, if you want to deep dive into any one of these series, if you want to hear me talk about more about Ghost in the Shell, more about Akira, let me know. We can do entire episodes on that. But I will also say that there are some other things like Judge Dredd, where the entire world is being run by this government that is actually led by the judges. So the judicial branch of the government is the only one that's left. And I would say that some people might look at Judge Dredd and think it didn't qualify as punk because we follow Judge Dredd. We follow a literal representation of authority. But I feel like Judge Dredd is not meant to be the hero. He is just a villain we are with. So I feel like it is still very much criticizing the systems of power. I still feel like Dredd is punk. It is cyberpunk. I just feel like we are just happen to be riding along with one of our villains. I do not think he's meant to be the hero. I don't even think he's meant to be an anti-hero. So I still feel it qualifies. If you disagree in the comments, let me know. Now, one thing I will mention is a series that I absolutely love, 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 but I am really torn on whether it counts as cyberpunk, and I don't think it does, which is Batman Beyond.
Yeah, it doesn't really delve into the cyber part of it. Like we know Batman in that series, Terry McGinnis, he has the technologically advanced suit, but it's not part of his personality and it's not the driving force of the questions we're asking here. Um I think it's more in line with what RoboCop is.
Well, and RoboCop is another excellent example. I think that there is an element of cyberpunk. Again, cybernetics with him. And I do feel like the government is criticized to an extent, although again, it does do the thing that a lot of cyberpunk does where the government gets given more of a pass and treated more as the victim of the corporations because like in RoboCop, the corporations are the evil. Now, I will say my problem is, in my opinion, I don't, it's that not that I don't think Batman Beyond is cyber enough. I think it's plenty cyber because, again, we do have his suit. We have them utilizing, a lot of the bad guys are very technological. We do see that very future tech thing going on. To me, I'm not sure it's punk enough because that's the I mean, we're obviously following a hero. He is a vigilante, so there's that, but I don't necessarily think we definitely never see the government, the police are never really depicted as the bad guys. And we do see some corporations depicted as the bad guys, but only if they're led by a villain. I'm not going to say it's definitely not, but it needs to be mentioned because it definitely feels cyberpunky, but I'm just not convinced it is cyberpunk enough to really be counted.
It's Hero Punk.
I could go with Hero Punk. And by the way, as you guys may have noticed, Hatter is just randomly throwing words in front of the word punk, hoping to create a genre. And he's not, and that is actually a fantastic example of how people do punk these days. And because people will just I mean, they will do lemonade punk. They do not give a crap what word they throw in front of the word punk and think that makes a genre. To an extent, I like it. Don't get me wrong. As long as you feel that word applies to your whatever, your story, your book, your movie, whatever, and then it really is punk, I'm down with it. I'm down for whatever kind of thing, but you better figure out a way to make it punk if you're going to make it punk.
Underpants Punk.
Okay, panty punk sounds like a thing. I'm not sure that you can talk about it on TikTok, but it sounds like a thing.
I will make it work. You wait and see.
It's just girl band punk, you know, like the band name you probably shouldn't say on TikTok that got trapped in Russia.
Oh my god, I loved watching the BBC try to say their name.
I'm out. I'm out of the loop here.
There was a band. Can we say this even on TikTok or on YouTube? I'm not entirely sure. You can edit it out if we shouldn't say it, but there was a band that was from England that was this is weirdly relevant. This was a punk band actually, and they were basically arrested and being held against their will in Russia because they traveled there, and the English government was trying to talk about them, and they all had to mention the name of the band, and the name of the band was Riot.
Oh. How did that work
So
out?
you had these very they eventually got negotiated for their release. I think it turned out just fine, Riot. But you had all these very proper British people having to say the word. So we are now negotiating for the release of Riot, and it was just the funniest thing.
I'll just replace that word with meow.
So everybody, I hope you guys enjoyed our very first venture into our explaining the punk genres. Make sure you let us know in the comment what genres you want to hear us talk about next. Again, we have solar punk, lunar punk, which is a really cool one. You want to know about that one? Let me know. We have atom punk, we have diesel punk, we have Tesla punk, we have biopunk. And there's an almost infinite number. We have versions that involve the Wild West. We have sail punk, saddle punk, sandal punk. So any of these that sound cool to you, let us know which one you want to hear about next. And we're going to get to all of them. Don't worry. And we're going to do a full deep dive into the entire punk genre. So once again, thank you for joining us. This has been our punk genre explained with the Gray Matters blog. And of course, our wonderful co-host Hatter. Make sure you follow him at Save Awesome Studios. Follow us, hit all the buttons, do all the likes, the follows, all that kind of thing. We should have all of our links in the description. And thank you for joining us and helping you. Pausing.
Sorry.